Okay. Okay. Very well then. We shall begin. So I'm Steve McKenna, and I'm going to moderate this small group of papers, which I perceive some links through in looking at the titles and listening, reading a little bit about each of the speakers. First up is Paul Lynch, Associate Professor of English at SLU, St. Louis Jesuit University. He's the director of the writing program there, still, correct? Not anymore. Okay, yes. You were Jesuit University. I see. He's you're familiar with prison, though, because he also worked in the prison education program there. But you're familiar with prison, though, because is a rhetorician by education program, as am I. So he and I have had cross paths any number of times at rhetoric conferences, as am I. So about Girard to people who scratch their heads, cross paths any number to Girardians talking about rhetoric about Girard their heads. So we're always caught in the middle of things. Anyway, Paul is the author of rhetoric to people's really brilliant and interesting things. Anyway, Paul would recommend a Contagion of really rhetoric, René Girard as Theoretor. Anyway, Paul, a bit of that Contagion article called "Recover the Current Project" for sure. And he's also into the current project has the Rhetoric and Religion article. You're the co-editor of Rhetoric and Religion. The Rhetoric and Religion article. And most the author of Rhetoric and Religion in the 21st Century, 2023. Most of Rhetoric and Religion in the Cambridge History of Rhetoric. Existing is this beautiful book, Persuasions of God, Inventing René Girard's Rhetoric. Forthcoming, but now I have been very excitedly reading about Persuasions of God, and I'm finding it deeply rewarding. Forthcoming, but now hear what he has to say here. Persuasions of God.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to our audience members. I think we now have an equal number of audience members and presenters, which is great. That's the line you want to hit. So thank you for being here. Just a quick note, that's the line you want to. Slides are out of order, so I may be doing some jumping around. I just didn't want to send David yet another correction of my slide presentation. So sorry for the going back and forth. I want to begin my remarks with the conference theme, Desire Among the Ruins, Mimesis and the Crisis of Representation, a theme that invokes the ruins of our archaeological sites of our host country, along with, or sites that still resonate, with what they describe as archaic echoes and demands. But the theme also makes reference to the ruins of representation occasioned by the work of Emmanuel Levinas, whose philosophical project concluded that the most primordial human experience is prior to representation, which always risks distorting. Whose philosophical project concluded that the most primordial human experience is the determination of the other by the same, with the same being determined by the other. Representation is a human experience of Gyges, whose invisible ring allows him to see others without risking being seen by those others, is a function and therefore equally subject to them. Representation has also been brought to a crisis by René Girard, whose anthropology hypothesizes that mimetic desire emerges somewhere before and below. Has also been brought to a crisis both during the development of a single human anthropology hypothesizes the evolution of humanity itself. Our representations then tend to obscure or even mythologize the workings of mimetic desire and its effects. As the conference organizers suggest, these claims raise serious questions about the efficacy of representation, whether in language or image. By the time representation reaches the subject, these claims raise serious always already being formed and reformed either by the other's ethical demand or the mediator's desire. The primacy of these forces suggests that representation is possibly merely an epiphenomenon, something that can at best gloss our encounter with some post hoc meaning. These conclusions also raise serious questions about what I've called in a recent book, thank you, Steve, for the plug, Persuasions of God, Inventing the Rhetoric of René Girard. There is I printed off some flyers with a nice discount for the conference. I put 25 down there this morning. I'm told there are only 24 left. So you better hustle down there if you want the discount. But This project pursues a project of what I call, borrowing from Steve Mayu, a rhetorician, both Steve and I know, theorhetoric, the rhetoric we use when talking to, for, or about God. Talking to, for, or about suggests a need for representation in order for us to communicate with God or God to communicate with us. We need only recall Abraham's argument with God over the fate of Sodom, or Moses' pleas to God to choose someone else to send to Egypt. We need both of these encounters. God meets his human creatures halfway. The Almighty adjusts the Almighty's plans through persuasion. But the crisis of representation noted by this conference suggests that persuasion, mediated is often through the representation of language, symbols, and even image, may actually have little capacity to affect change. Perhaps the arguments between God and humans have no impact on the ethical and mimetic dynamics shaping the interlocutors. Long before perhaps the arguments between God and humans have no impact. Perhaps what finally persuades God to send Aaron with Moses is not so much Moses' pleas, but simply Moses' desire. At this point in God's story, God may be as subject to mimetic desire as any mortal creature. If this is true, then perhaps the only plausible meaning of the word persuasion is a third, more colloquial and obscure usage in English, and I don't know if this translates into other languages, in which persuasion refers to the way somebody already is. Often this usage has mocking or even malicious undertones. In an earlier era, genteel bigots might have said that a social club was not open to anyone of the Jewish persuasion, for example. In this usage, persuasion refers paradoxically to some aspect of a person that the speaker would prefer to be different, but that probably cannot be changed. Ironically, then, this meaning of persuasion refers to something that is not amenable to persuasion, different, but that probably. Yet this last meaning seems closer to the theories of subjectivity forwarded by Levinas and Girard, both of whom agree that we become subjects by becoming subject. There is not an I that is then persuaded to respond to my appeal or conform to my desire. That appeal and that desire precede my I. They are, in fact, the condition of possibility for it. I think this may be the sort of problem that the conference organizers are getting at when they ask, is desire condemned to walk among the ruins of mimetic failures, or can it open to the truly desirable, which they define as an alterity whose frailty no violence can reduce or silence? That is an existential question for the persuasions of God, particularly those that proceed in a Christian key, which cannot help but imply the great commission of Matthew 28:19, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. The great commission of Matthew Christian identity seems to raise the very problem that is raised by our conference organizers. So I want to approach this problem, this is the basic crux of my argument, that by suggesting that perhaps the most important persuasion of God is not about persuading God or even being persuaded by God, rather becoming persuadable in the first place. That is to say, persuasion is about becoming capable of being persuaded or being moved. This conclusion, I think, both confirms and challenges the theories of subjectivity articulated by Girard and Levinas. If they are right, then becoming receptive to the persuasion of God cannot simply be a matter of disengaging from the influence of others, which is ultimately an impossibility. What we can do, perhaps, is inhabit those persuasions differently, which is to say, to reconcile ourselves to persuasions that precede us, the persuasions that are always already happening. So I want to keep this possibility in mind as I turn now to a different set of ruins that were once called Christendom, but which are now sometimes described as post-secular or post-Christian. So if Christendom designates a culture in which Christian morality, thought, and discourse animate public culture, then we might take the phrase post-Christian to designate the culture that follows after Christianity has lost its central cultural place, often squandering it, along with much of its power and appeal. Mid-20th century Christian theologians have had to grapple with the ruins of the bloodiest war in the bloodiest century, which happened at the heart of Christendom, a culture that also invented industrial genocide and the atomic bomb. Early 21st century, especially Catholic theologians, must answer for the chronic problem of clerical sex abuse of children, and also most recently in the United States, the church's deep complicity with the transatlantic slave trade. My own archdiocese of children, and also most recently in the United States, the number of there's so many slave buildings in the archdiocese and on my campus named for bishops who were selling people for various cultural projects. It's devastating. So if this is Christendom, perhaps it is good that it lies in ruins, is my point. It's devastating. Some of the effects of these developments are represented in the central. If this is Christendom, perhaps it is good that it lies in ruins. This is just briefly, this is the former St. Laborious Church on the north side of St. Louis. now known as Skate Laborious. This church was opened in 1898, closed in 1992 because the north side of St. Louis, the largely German immigrants moved to the suburbs, right, assimilating and attaining wealth, and kind of abandoned the north side, which is now sort of the poorest area of the city of St. Louis where I live. And then 10 years after the closing, it became a skate park, hence the name Skate Laborious. Area of the city of St. Louis. Last year, it suffered this devastating fire. There is hope that the walls and the spire that you see can be maintained and the building could be rebuilt by the owners of the skate park. Which, as you can imagine, caused quite a bit of controversy. This place that had been a church was now the owners of the skate park. Right? So the park website currently reads, and sorry, this is where I have to jump around. Here's the part, and I have a Spanish translation. Since we were in Mexico, it's my translation. It's probably pretty clunky, but hopefully it gets the idea across. Anyway, this is part of the current mission. For 10 years, we've been a sanctuary for skateboarders, BMX riders, quad skaters, artists, and musicians. I don't know what a quad skater is actually, but it sounds fun. But I obviously want us to note the word sanctuary in that statement. What a quad skater is actually, but it sounds fun. One of the owners of Skate Laborious said, "The society that built these types of buildings doesn't exist anymore. It took them 20 years to build it, 1850 to 1870. It was an incredible building, and if we don't save this type of stuff, it will be gone." Underserved urban youth, that's the congregation here now. So I want to note, obviously, the religious resonances of the language that's being used by this ostensibly non-religious entity. That's so non-religious, some people in the Archdiocese felt offended that they had taken the church over, right? It seems to me to strike a perfectly, articulates a perfectly post-secular idea in the sense outlined by Charles Taylor, who warns against seeing the secular age, warns against seeing it in terms of a subtraction story in which religion is somehow drained away like water in a leaky tub. For Taylor, post-secularity represents a world in which a transcendent horizon is replaced with an immanent one, which attempts to imagine and pursue human flourishing without reference to the supernatural or extra-human. But that doesn't mean that the religious, resonances and echoes of that former culture suddenly disappear. Now, full disclosure, I realize that both Taylor and I are talking about a particular set of nations, and that doesn't apply globally, of course. But I'm writing about that because that's where I live and work. Meanwhile, I think it's also safe to say that the church to which both Gerard and I and some at this conference here belong is undergoing its own post-secular or post-Christian shift. The theologian Michelle Dillon has argued that the Catholic Church finds itself in a period of what she calls contrite Catholicism, a phrase she borrows from Jürgen Habermas's notion of contrite modernity. A contrite Catholicism, Dillon argues, acknowledges the Church's betrayal of its own mission, along with acknowledging the altered landscape in which that mission has to be pursued. Contrition is not defeatism, Dillon insists, but rather a recognition that the Church must articulate its witness in language different than perhaps the one it is used to. She writes, "Post-secularity requires the active translation of faith into a meaningful secular vocabulary." And if you were in the last session, that's what I was asking the speaker about, whose name's flying out of my head. Duncan Morrow, thank you, Steve. About that kind of evangelical language and how it was operating in his context. In other words, the Church's traditional language and appeals, its traditional forms of representation, also appear to be in crisis, right, and need rethinking. This crisis is also attested to many thinkers who have argued that conventional Christian vocabulary has become a stumbling block. These include people like Marcus Borg, Bruno Latour, Jonathan Merrick, Kathleen Norris, Gianni Vattimo, and even René Girard, who writes, "We must be aware of calling Jesus' action sacrificial, even if we then have no words or categories to convey its meaning. The very lack of appropriate language suggests that we are dealing with a type of conduct for which there is no precedent in the realm of mythology or philosophy." This is why the rhetoricians among us are, trying to talk to each other, right? Three of these thinkers I just mentioned, Borg, Merritt, and Norris, have in fact gone so far as to produce lexicons. You can see the titles here: Speaking Christian, Amazing Grace doesn't hint at, I don't know if you can see the subtitle is A Vocabulary of Faith. and learning to speak God from scratch. Now, granted, these are all Americans, so maybe this is a particularly American hang-up. If anyone has any insight into that, I'd welcome it. But that's not limited to these three. There also recently was produced a Pope Francis lexicon. Many of the terms are familiar: baptism, church, conscience, but many are of Francis's particular vintage, including some of my favorites, sourpuss and gossip. Perhaps the most representative example of his own coinings are throwaway culture, right? A phrase that if you've ever heard him speak or written or read any of his writings, you will have come across. The throwaway culture is the attitude that everything, including other human beings, is usable and then discardable. Sister Pat Farrell notes in her essay on resisting throwaway culture that it requires a deeply incarnational spirituality. Sorry, that's where I have to jump around. This is Pat Farrell. Literally rubbing shoulders on a crowded bus creates embodied memory. The illusion of separation is shattered when body parts collide, that physical knowing endures. Likewise, in his essay on culture of encounter, another Franciscan term to outline the lexicon, Archbishop Victor Manuel Fernandez writes that a culture of encounter envisions a society in which different people can live together, complement each other, and illuminate each other. Although this doesn't exclude arguments or distrust, we can learn something from everyone. No one is useless. No one is expendable. A couple things I just want to say about this is, first of all, as a rhetorician, I'm contractually obliged to note that this idea preserves both people and perspectives, that arguments are allowed in this culture of encounter, that a culture of peace is not a culture that's completely free of conflict. I think that's important to mention in this Gerardian context. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. The other thing we could note about both of these comments is that this revived vocabulary of a culture of encounter and being against a throwaway culture, suggestive as it is, depends not so much on representation or meaning as upon an encounter with the other, right? One creates a non-throwaway culture not by talking about it, but by inhabiting it, which I think is similar to Duncan Morrow's point. One creates a culture of encounter by, encountering, not by theorizing or even defining. If such a culture can sustain argument, it is because it sustains exposure, sustains vulnerability to the other. Such a culture is thus Levinasian insofar as it begins with proximity. It is also Gerardian in that it imagines solidarity without scapegoats and no one getting thrown away. So what role then does representation have? If we are in the ruins of representation, it is because we have come to understand that literally rubbing shoulders with someone is much more likely to be persuasive than any formal appeal or argument could ever be. This is both bad and good news for people who study rhetoric. And yet we still have these repeated attempts at devising new language. We still have these attempts at focusing on vocabulary, even with its risk of representation, which again, according to Levinas, claims to substitute itself after the event for this life and reality, so as to constitute this very reality. What role could there then be for representation in the persuasions of God? So to begin to close and land this plane, what I want to suggest is that we understand the persuasion of God to refer to how we make ourselves persuadable. In other words, the persuasion of God would refer to the paradoxical notion of actively making oneself passive enough to hear the language of the other. Persuasion, and by extension rhetoric, therefore becomes not the conventional idea of mastering techniques so as to master other people. Rather, it is about a kind of self-mastery that makes one available for the kind of veritable conversations imagined by Levinas, the kind of conversations that allow the other to speak. The ruins of rhetoric might then be understood as the ruins of the idea of rhetoric as an art that teaches people how to persuade successfully, which is usually the argument people like us use to persuade people that take persuasion seriously. In the midst of those ruins, however, rhetoric might be re-seen as a willingness to undergo. And this is where I'm going to jump back. The rhetoricians Roderick Hart and Don Burks captured this aspiration in a concept they call rhetorical sensitivity, which is characterized by several attributes, one of which is that the rhetor, the rhetorically sensitive person, is characteristically willing to undergo the strain of adaptation. The idea of the strain of adaptation reverses the conventional understanding of rhetoric in which the rhetor makes the audience adapt to the rhetor's view, right? And instead replaces it with one in which the emphasizes that the rhetor is adapting toward the audience. Conversely, Hartenbergs rightfully see adaptation, or not conversely, in keeping with that, Hartenbergs rightfully see adaptation as a strain, which suggests that they appreciate the real difficulty of rhetorical adaptation, which exposes us to the other in ways that are risky. Okay? Let me turn back to close here to the lexicons I mentioned a moment ago. A traditional notion of rhetoric driven by the idea of representation might see those glossaries as offering tools for use, or what Aristotle called the available means of persuasion. Okay? Francis, for example, has made available the idea of a throwaway culture, and now rhetoricians can use that as a topos, or a place from which to make arguments. It's all well and good. But for at least one of the authors, and particularly the American poet Kathleen Norris, the motivation to write her glossaries was her own struggle to rehear Christian language. When I began attending church, When I began attending church again after 20 years, I felt bombarded by the vocabulary of the Christian church. In order to make church a place she could remain, she describes needing to rebuild her own religious vocabulary. In other words, she was managing her own sense of what Hartenbergs call rhetorical strain, her own adaptation to a Christian language that had become, as she describes it, dauntingly abstract and even vaguely threatening. For her, then, the representation of Christian vocabulary was a therapeutic project. It was not about finding better words to use on others, but better words that she could hear herself. By the way, I would note of the 4 lexicon authors I mentioned, Norris is the only woman and the only revert, that is, the only person who came back to faith after a period of away. And I think that marginal place makes her work particularly compelling for the project I'm trying to pursue here. Obviously, the crisis in representation does not mean that we can somehow do away with representation. Without representation, its therapeutic effects, Girard's notion of mimesis would not be available to us at all. But by seeing representation as a means of our adaptation to openness to the other, to see it as what we in the States sometimes call a me problem rather than a you problem, we might sidestep the risks of representation as something that calcifies and thus warps some primary originary experience. We might see its ruins as the place from which we can invent vocabulary that we can actually hear. Thank you.
Okay, I'm now going to very briefly introduce Professor Reginald McGinnis, who I'm sorry to say I've only just met. From some brief conversation, it seems like we should have met previously. Reg McGinnis received his PhD in French from Stanford. He's the author of a number of tantalizingly titled books, La Prostitution Sacrée, Essai sur Baudelaire, and Essai sur l'origine de la mystification, and co-author of a book called Mock Ritual in the Modern Era, Oxford 2022. I already have it in my Amazon queue. So, and a number of other things in French studies. He's runs the, you're the DGS there, Director of Graduate Studies at University of Arizona in sunny Tucson, a place I've visited a number of times. It's very nice. And he will speak to us about another rhetorician of sorts, I guess we could say, a belletrist, a French belletrist of the 18th century. And so rather than say anything more, I'm looking very much forward to what he has to say.
Thank you, Steve, for that nice introduction. So I was a bit of a late addition to the program, and I don't have any slides. I feel like with this conference, it's really good to have them. But I'm talking today about an author I've been working on for a few years, the Abbé Mallet, who was the theologian of Diderot and d'Alembert's great encyclopedia. Most people don't know Mallet, and he's an interesting figure to study because he's kind of a contre-courant, sort of against the grain, because, well, for reasons I'll try to elaborate here. But having written articles on a subject that tends to get, rather spiny, because the Encyclopédie is a very, very big work, and a lot of has been written and said about it over the years. My idea was I try to present broadly the kind of things I work on with Mallet in a way that's hopefully understandable for people who probably don't know it, really well. And well, you'll tell me if I'm successful at all or not. So the Abbé Mallet, largely forgotten today, was an 18th century French theologian and man of letters. He achieved a degree of celebrity in his time for his work on Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopedia. I'm going to say that in English because I don't want to say encyclopédie every time the way they do. To which he contributed articles in commerce, ancient and modern history, literature, and religion, among other subjects. A volume of selected articles from this work translated into English shortly after Mallet's death. So the encyclopedia, the first volumes come out in the early 1750s, and it's suspended, and there's a lot of problems around the publication, and it ends in the late 1760s, basically. And then there's this English anthology that shows up around 1770. So in this work, translated into English shortly after Mallet's death, Mallet was presented in part of its extended title as being authored by Mallet, Diderot, d'Alembert, and others, the most celebrated writers of the age. So what's remarkable there is that Mallet is really the first in line of that list. No one would ever imagine that. In the 18th century, Mallet's reputation was essentially tied to that of the encyclopedia. It was only retrospectively from the mid-20th century forward that a separation began to appear. While this paper and my work more generally is about Mallet, his writings, and his contributions to the encyclopedia, it is no less concerned with his critical reception, and particularly with a seismic shift in scholarly opinion. I'm curious also about how the changing views of Mallet may be related more broadly to the evolution of the thinking on religion in modernity. If Mallet was originally viewed as a contributor to the encyclopedia, along with Diderot, d'Alembert, and others, only to be singled out later as a contradiction, this undoubtedly has everything to do with the ways in which the work was discussed, taught, and anthologized during the secular era as an essentially anti-religious work. Yeah, if you go to university and you take one course on the encyclopedia, you probably learn that the revolution happened because of that, against the monarchy and the church, and that's the book, right? So within that, what do you do with a theologian? Seen from that angle, the inclusion of an Orthodox theologian appears suspect. The pivotal moment regarding critical judgments of Mallet was the publication of an article in the mid-1970s by Berkeley professor Walter E. Rex. Whereas Mallet had traditionally been portrayed, notably by d'Alembert himself, as a moderate theologian open to dialogue with philosophers, Rex was struck by what appeared to him as an incompatibility between Mallet and the spirit of the encyclopedia. Founding his inquiry on a set of assumptions related, for instance, to tolerance and religious persecution, Rex was repeatedly drawn to passages and articles by Mallet that seemingly contradict Enlightenment principles. From there, Rex arrived at the conclusion that Mallet had written hundreds of theological articles for the work to, quote, offset the libertine tendencies of the other contributors, that he was a pawn in the service of Jean-François Boyer, Bishop of Mirepoix, and a notorious opponent of the encyclopedia, and that d'Alembert had, for reasons unknown, undertaken to conceal Mallet's nefarious deeds in his eulogy. We had, in short, entered the era of suspicion. That's a reference to Nathalie Sarraute and his, you didn't know that one. In the decades that followed, Rex's article slowly gained acceptance in academic circles and was later consecrated with its publication in French in the authoritative journal Recherches sur Diderot et sur l'Encyclopédie. It has often been cited, including by eminent scholars, and its influence is visible in the official biography of Mallet on the Édition numérique collaborative et critique de l'Encyclopédie, which is the government-funded online version of the encyclopedia, which is a great piece of work. What they say about Mallet is highly questionable, but apart from that, it's good work. What we observe through this process is essentially of the invention of a myth that has its origins neither in a distant past nor in superstition, but in a modern academic setting relying in principle on reasoned argument. What Rex does in his article is to identify inconsistencies with his own expectations with respect to the encyclopedia and the content of some of Mallet's religious articles, from which he derives a number of conclusions that would later be accredited, less through a process of analysis and verification, than in a collective act of passive acceptance. No one has ever demonstrated, for instance, the precise nature and extent of Mallet's supposed involvement in a conspiracy against the encyclopedia, nor has it ever been proven that Mallet's theological articles were originally intended to counterbalance other irreligious or anti-religious articles, let alone that d'Alembert would have been complicit in this. Incongruities between various statements in Mallet's article and Rex's assumptions about the encyclopedia could be explained either by resorting to a conspiracy theory, as Rex does, or by dispelling his assumptions, including, for instance, about Mallet's views of the Jansenists. According to Rex's interpretation, Mallet's writings display a bias in favor of the Jesuits and intolerance toward the Jansenists, particularly in the censored article Constitution that was intended for the fourth volume of the encyclopedia in 1754. Let me elaborate briefly on this example. Even prior to the publication of the first volume, the encyclopedia was met with controversy. The exclusion of the Jesuits from Diderot and d'Alembert's list of contributors, d'Alembert speaks of this here and there in later years, had left them with a simmering resentment. While the Jesuit father Guillaume François Berthier accused the encyclopedists of plagiarism in the Journal de Trévoux, the Jansenists followed in the clandestine journal Nouvelles Ecclésiastiques with criticism of the thesis of the youthful Abbé de Prades, newly recruited to the encyclopedia, as irreligious. They accused his thesis of being irreligious. I have written elsewhere on how the circumstances surrounding the encyclopedia resembled a Girardian sacrificial crisis, but to avoid self-citation, I'll rely here on a summary by Dale K. Van Clay from his conclusion to a recent book, God and the Enlightenment. So I'm quoting Van Clay here. When the Jesuits tried to dissociate themselves from the encyclopedic enterprise by making a scapegoat of the Abbé Martin de Prades, a collaborator who defended a quite Lockean doctoral thesis at the Sorbonne, the Jansenists used their clandestine weekly periodical Nouvelles Ecclésiastiques to launch a major assault against the Jesuits, the anti-Jansenist Sorbonne, for having prepared the way for philosophic unbelief by way of their anti-Augustinian theological rehabilitation of post-Lapsarian human nature. The anti-Jesuit Royal Law Court, the Parliament of Paris, also waded into the controversy more or less on the Jansenist side. For the men of letters or the philosophes associated with the Encyclopédie, the result was a separating out into a self-conscious party of reason, equally opposed to Jesuit and Jansenist varieties of religious fanaticism, and dedicated to the cause of enlightenment. Although for different reasons, both Jesuits and Jansenists agreed with this philosophical self-assessment, equating encyclopedic philosophie with unbelief while blaming each other for its rise. So in the quarrels surrounding these first volumes of the encyclopedia, philosophers are pitted against clergymen who are themselves engaged in an ongoing polemic over the bull Unigenitus. The circumstances correspond closely to a Girardian sacrificial crisis, temporarily resolved via the election of a scapegoat, the Abbé de Prades. So behind the fabled war of philosophy and religion, there are divisions between religious camps. Reviewing this episode of French literary history through a Girardian lens can be useful in dissolving preconceptions pertaining to 18th century French philosophy. In his interpretation of Mallet, Rex is struck by criticism of the Jansenists in the article Constitution. Working from the notion that the encyclopedia promoted the ideal of tolerance, Rex concluded that criticism of the Jansenists in articles by Mallet subverted this ideal, thus placing him at variance with Diderot, d'Alembert, and the other contributors. According to Rex, Mallet had chosen a moment when the quarrel between the Jansenists and the Jesuits had been dying down to publish a blistering attack on the former. But there is no proof that the decision as to when this article, of which Mallet is not actually the author but rather the compiler, would have been his to make. He was not in a position to make that decision. The time of publication and of this and other articles would rather most likely have been dictated by alphabetical order. It's famously a work that followed alphabetical order, which wasn't the standard thing necessarily at that time. And the vast majority of Mallet's articles were, moreover, completed prior to the publication of the first volume of the Encyclopedia a few years before. Apart from practical matters concerning the composition of the work, Rex makes a critical oversight that has gone largely unquestioned in failing to observe the similarity of Mallet's views of the Jansenists to those of Diderot and d'Alembert. His singling out of Mallet for criticism that could equally be applied to the editors of the Encyclopedia summarizes what to me is most interesting about this topic. Everything happens as if, on the question of religion in the Encyclopedia, the accepted view of an opposition between philosophy and theology overrides all other considerations. Mallet's reputed intolerance, particularly in the article Constitution, could be compared to d'Alembert's disdain for the Jansenists, for instance, in an article from the 5th volume, Ecclesiastical News, he writes, is the very improper title of a periodical paper, or rather libel, without wit, without truth, without charity, and without avowal, that has been published clandestinely since 1728 and that appears regularly each week. The anonymous author of this work, who could likely name himself without being any better known, informs the public 4 times each month of the adventures of a few tonsured clerics, lay sisters, parish priests, and monks, a few convulsionnaires, appellant or reappellant, and that's just part way into the first sentence. Yeah, so d'Alembert covers with disdain and derision these Jansenists, of whom Mallet is accused of disdaining himself. So rather than in opposition, they're really very much in line. And to me, it's quite a striking oversight. It's the whole thing of starting from this opposition that's very much institutionally transmitted, translated over time. If you've learned anything about the encyclopedia, you learn there's the opposition. And there's a lot to support that. As much as it's false as anything, but the way it becomes sort of monumentalized is highly problematic. D'Alembert's derisive tone is sustained throughout the article and is indicative of an attitude towards the Jansenists that was also reflected, for instance, in Diderot's response to the pastoral instruction of the Bishop of Auxerre in the 3rd volume of the Apology for the Abbé de Prades. When I say that this example summarizes what to me is most intriguing about the critical reception of Mallet, I'm specifically referring to the way in which, after 2 centuries of having been viewed in keeping with d'Alembert's portrayal as a moderate theologian open to dialogue with skeptics, he came to be an object of suspicion. If anything, I am less fascinated with Mallet himself than with the ways in which criticism has polarized around a negative view of him, working from bits and pieces of evidence, speculations, and suppositions that have at times been followed up with studies supporting Rex's interpretation, creating the appearances of verification while ignoring obvious points. For instance, no one has ever followed up on the implication of Rex's thesis that if Mallet was involved in a conspiracy against the encyclopedia, d'Alembert himself would have had to be complicit. But to do so, one would need to show when and why such a conspiracy began, how d'Alembert became involved, and what his own motives could have been. I mean, when I hear myself read this, it's just also highly unlikely to me. But I find it's interesting in a way to work on, we all do this. I think, you're working on something over time, for reasons that are your own, you came to it. And now with conspiracy theory, just like all over the place, I mean, I find it's contemporary in a way. Everything happens as if Mallet, the encyclopedia's main theologian, had come to represent in the minds of modern critics everything that is worse in religion, and thus necessarily a contradiction with respect to a work considered above all as anti-religious. Rex's interpretation starts from a progressivist view of the encyclopedia and a presumed opposition of philosophy and religion. All of the ensuing questions and conclusions flow from this initial framing. One may ask, however, whether, in considering Mallet, Rex did not put the cart before the horse. If he mistook a result for a cause, which is to say, if he assumed that the consequences of the encyclopedia, as reflected in the polemics from the period in the later analyses, were necessarily aligned with its original objectives. For instance, Jonathan Israel has written these books, Radical Enlightenment. Every 2 years there's a 1,000-page volume that comes out with it at Oxford, and he's very much promoting like the atheist enlightenment, radical, anti-religious, and very progressive. And I think he's very good in some ways, honestly, but he's not attentive to detail, especially because he's working on, multiple traditions. That's very impressive. The European, he masters several languages and traditions, and he's synthesizing. But yeah, those sort of generalizations are typical of what you see, and so he works very much from those sort of hardened oppositions. The shift in opinion regarding Mallet belongs to a time when scholars, including Robert Darnton, for instance, often assumed that the encyclopedia had helped bring about a definitive break between philosophy and religion, between theology and the new scientific world. I'm personally skeptical that any such break ever occurred, at least in any absolute sense. Vaguely, I guess, Bruno Latour, we have never been modern, as is not the title of the book, huh? Or was it a question? I can't recall. More plausibly, the inheritance of the Enlightenment can be conceived of in terms of vestiges or recurrences of religious structures, whether mental or social, as with Emmanuel Todd's zombie Catholicism or Protestantism. Todd publishes a book every year too, it seems to me. I was reading his book on Charlie Hebdo a few years ago, which is very provocative, it's very interesting, frankly. But he has this term zombie Catholicism and Protestantism, a sort of vestige of a religion that's no longer in full force, or at least outside a simple binary, as with Marcel Gauchet's characterization of Christianity as the religion of the exit from religion. As to say, it seems to me that you only have a problem with Mallet if you're persuaded to begin with that philosophers and theologians are at war with each other. And if you're not, then it's not really much of a problem. So from any kind of an angle where you can conceive of a dialogue, once you've sort of seen it, it seems to me that my problem I try and solve here is already solved. It is plausible, after all, that a dialogue between philosophy and theology, which in the mid-18th century maintained the status of a science, the queen of the sciences, Kant would later write, was present in the encyclopedia, if only as a reflection of the prevailing habits of the period. As a theologian, Mallet was well versed in virtually all areas of science. His essay Sur l'étude des belles lettres, published in 1747, same year he was hired to work on the encyclopedia, notably provides an overview not only of literature, history, and philosophy, but of mathematics, physics, and geometry, and other sciences. And theology was foreign neither to Diderot nor to D'Alembert. One could attempt to reconstruct such a dialogue starting from the unsigned article A priori demonstration, which I'll quote here in its entirety. A priori demonstration, in the language of the scholastics, is that in which one proves an effect by its cause, either immediate or distant, or in which a conclusion is proven by something that precedes it, either as a cause or only as an antecedent. So that's a full article. And it's followed by a much longer article, which is by D'Alembert. And this begins, a priori demonstration, properly speaking, is a direct demonstration drawn from the nature of the thing one wishes to prove. A posteriori demonstration is an indirect demonstration drawn from some foreign circumstance or secondary property. Thus, to demonstrate that there is a God by attending to the nature and attributes of the infinitely perfect being is to demonstrate the existence of God a priori, or by arguments drawn from the very nature of the subject. To demonstrate the existence of God via the existence of the world and the universe is to demonstrate it a posteriori. This latter form of proof is that which is most generally accepted. Philosophers and even theologians are divided over a priori demonstrations. which are even rejected by some. I won't read the whole. Steve, are you timing me? Am I running low?
Yes, sir.
Good. Okay, good. Well, I'll kind of go toward the end then. Thanks. I think I was in time when I read it this morning, but you never know once you're really doing it. This rather lengthy quotation relating to theology, which I just abridged a bit, is followed by examples from the natural sciences. D'Alembert writes, for instance, more briefly, in the natural sciences, for I'm not speaking here of objects of faith, only the objects of mathematics is absolutely susceptible of demonstration. This comes from the simplicity of this object, of its object, no doubt, and the hypotheses according to which it is considered. In the other sciences, proofs are either purely conjectural or partly demonstrations and partly conjectures. In physics, for instance, we have demonstrations of the cause of rainbows, and we only have conjectures as to the cause of light. This is because in almost all the sciences, the first causes are unknown and the first principles obscured. There is clarity only in the effects and the consequences drawn from them. Yes, so I took that example because clearly there, D'Alembert is talking about how demonstration works both in theology and in the natural sciences. Within the field of 18th century French studies, one of the habits institutionally acquired is to dismiss as ironical passages from D'Alembert or Diderot that could be interpreted as giving serious weight to theology. But if one were to apply this rule universally, it would be strictly impossible to identify any such passages. Curiosity would be forbidden and all conclusions would be predetermined. In the lines I just quoted, the parenthetical statement, for I am not speaking here of objects of faith, could be taken either literally or as a form of preterition. Either D'Alembert is simply considering demonstrations in theology as compared to the other sciences, or he may be underscoring the uncertainty of theological proofs. But even if it were the latter, given that mathematics is said to be the only science whose object is absolutely susceptible of demonstration, theological proofs would still be questioned along with those of most other sciences, in which the first causes are unknown. No doubt D'Alembert, and particularly Diderot, make statements that are dismissive or derisive of theology, but this in itself does not preclude the possibility of a dialogue between philosophers and theologians in the encyclopedia. In the article Ecclesiastical, D'Alembert praises the historian Claude Fleury, declaring this judicious writer, in elaborating his discourses, the ways in which God preserves the church, shows at the same time the different sorts of abuses that crept into it. A brief quotation from Fleury provided by D'Alembert, which I won't read here, might also be interpreted as ironical, but I'm inclined not to think so, particularly given D'Alembert's repeated praise of Fleury in his later writings. You always hear that, well, during the time of the encyclopedia, they had to speak a certain way, otherwise they'd be censored, and that's true. There were concerns like that, but I don't think it explains everything. And why would D'Alembert, 20 years later, when it's no longer an issue, still be praising the same Fleury? The dialogue I've begun to outline here could be continued by following out from cross-references, notably to the article Cosmology and a posteriori demonstration, but also in the article Theology, whose style is also very scientific, and which has led some critics to read it ironically. Thanks for your listening.
Okay, last but not least, we have Stefano Santasilia. Very nice to meet you. And I've done a little bit of homework on Professor Santasilia. He is a professor of metaphysics at Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, here in Mexico, and as a PhD from Pontificia Universidad de Clínicas, and is that in Madrid? Yeah, okay. And postdoctoral work in Latin American studies at Universidad de Nápoles Oriental in Italy. So, he specializes in a number of fields, phenomenology and hermeneutics, in religious experience, fenomenología de la I'm translating from Spanish, phenomenology of corporality of the body, phenomenology of the body and habitation, living, all right, okay. And also the philosophy of interculturality and peace. And I suppose that is going to be something of what we'll be hearing here on Interreligious Dialogue as a crisis of religious violence. So,
Steve, I was putting this section at the last one, very last minute. They took me some time to drop it here.
oh, no one informed me. Oh boy,
They should have told you.
yeah, no one told me. So we're very tight on time now. I've been watching it. I'm sorry, Bill.
No.
Okay, so I'm not sure what we should do here. We'll have to.
I'll read fast.
Okay. So
You said read fast.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Well,
no,
well, thank you very much for this possibility. And well, I'm first of all, I am very sorry about my bad English, and I hope I will get to the end without boring you too much. Well, in the field of peace studies, that is, studies that deal with diffusing the mechanism of violence, the question of interreligious dialogue represents a peculiar process that can shed light on a profoundly interesting possibility. Generally, this kind of process is not considered as dynamic oriented towards building peace, but rather in its relation to the creation of a possible communication between two or more different traditions. However, among the methods that aim to build peace, the structuring of interreligious dialogue represents an important moment due to its specific characteristics. This kind of dialogue requires the recognition of an experience of the absolute, which, while implying total adhesion, also reveals the impossibility of transferring this adhesion. This would demonstrate that any attempt to impose personal adherence would generate, as a direct consequence, the loss of the relationship with the absolute. In this sense, and in an apparently paradoxical way, interreligious dialogue, in its fundamental structure, presents the religious experience itself as constitutive, in its most authentic form, of a possible example of a crisis of religious violence. But in order to show what has just been said, I'll have to consider the internal articulation of what we are affirming, and for this reason, this presentation will be divided into two moments. First one, determination of the meaning of religious experience as adherence to the absolute. This experience will be read through the filter of the phenomenological perspective. And two, possible constitution and implementation of interreligious dialogue. Sense of religious experience. The choice of the phenomenological perspective as a modality considered privileged regarding the description of the religious experience derives from the need to determine its meaning starting from its form of manifestation. Nonetheless, the issue does not appear to be simple at all. In fact, the possibility of talking about religious experience in a phenomenological perspective has generated and continues to generate the need to clarify from the beginning what kind of phenomenology is being referred to, or rather what kind of phenomenological approach is considered to describe this peculiar mode of manifestation. In short words, if it is possible, and if it were, how is it possible to think of the divine as a manifestation? And in fact, the phenomenology of religion, which from a strictly phenomenological point of view should be defined more as phenomenology of religious experience, fundamentally seeks to highlight the modalities of this kind of manifestation. And what is strongly characterized as a possible history of the phenomenology of religion is precisely the variation that can be recorded in the conception of the phenomenon. At this moment, there is no time to develop in detail a review of the positions taken by those who could be considered the protagonists of this discipline. Yet this impediment does not limit us from being able to identify a key trait that marks the phenomenological reflection in his attempt to relate to the problem of transcendence right from the beginning of his journey, and it concerns the perception of an excess. Starting from the question of the transcendence of the world and its difference with respect to the divine transcendence, Husserlian reflection is already forced, despite its attempt to keep God within the context of a phenomenological configured philosophical theology, to recognize the possibility of a further transcendence which completely differs from that of the world, and which, therefore, cannot be simply traced back to a standing in front. In this case, the trace of the reflection that begins in paragraph 51 of the first volume of Ideen, and which finds its inconclusive conclusion at the end of paragraph 58, clearly shows what we are saying. But this is only the beginning of the history, of the story, I'm sorry. A simple look at the history of phenomenology, even the most general and the less detailed, like that of Spiegelberg, for example, bears witness to the presence of this problem of the excess in relation to the attempt to identify the modality of the manifestation of the divine dimension. Manifestation which constitutes the fundamental nucleus of religious experience, and which, precisely because of this excess, is considered above all as an experience of alterity, otherness. A condition that we can recognize in all the phenomenologists who have attempted to elaborate a description of the configuration of this kind of manifestation. Even if we wanted to separate from the list those authors whose rigorous ascription to the phenomenological orientation could be problematic, such as Van der Leeuw, Eliade, and even Rudolf Otto himself, the names that would constitute a rapid but always honest sequence of authentic exponents of that which I prefer to define as the phenomenology of religious experience cannot fail to consider Max Scheler, Edith Stein, Jan Hering, Adolf Reinach, Martin Heidegger, and above all, the guilty authors of the Tournant Théologique, according to the famous definition of Dominique Janicot, such as Emmanuel Levinas, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, Jean-Luc Chrétien, and I would like to add also Jean-Yves Lacoste and Emmanuel Lucet. All of them represent the confirmation of the identification of the excess as a fundamental trace of religious experience. It is worth trying to understand the meaning of the excess indicated as a specific characteristic of this experience of alterity, which is constituted as religious. It is not a simple transcendence. For this reason, Husserl himself spoke of a different transcendence, but rather an overcoming, exceeding, starting from an original condition that already includes us. This would be the paradoxical condition of the excess, which, as Juan Martín Velasco underlines in his monumental Introducción a la Fenomenología de la Religión, is characterized by a double modality. The first one is a bidirectionality that refers to the movement ad extra and ad intra. The second one refers directly to the original dimension, a prior condition which, while preceding us in the form of origin, passes through us and happens. That is, assuming the condition of the Christian formula of the Alpha and Omega. It's clear that this kind of description presents itself already as paradoxical, in the sense that Jean-Luc Marion recognizes about this term, that is in the form of a negative certainty, and for this reason, problematically phenomenal, but not problematically phenomenological. In fact, as Stefano Bancalari recognizes, it almost seems that the phenomenology of religion tries to identify the mode of manifestation of a phenomenon that imposes a fracture with respect to the parameters initially established by the phenomenological foundation regarding the real possibility of the phenomenon. We can say, without problem, that a rigorous phenomenological phenomenology of religion constitutes the obligatory opening of a path of rethinking the status of the phenomenon. And this would depend on being a manifestation of an excess which is overcoming, but above all, independent from the intentionality of consciousness. If this were not the case, we would be talking about an illusion. Nor is it possible to adopt a minimal position that it is an experience that affects some and not others, because such a statement would undermine the claim of universality and absoluteness, fundamental traits of this experience. And the assumption of this condition allows us to move on the second moment of this reflection: constitution and implementation of interreligious dialogue. If religious experience is an experience of relationship with the absolute, which manifests itself as an excess oriented according to universality, then it is necessary to ask ourselves what absolute we are talking about. In this sense, I consider that the reference to the reflection developed by Sergio Sorrentino regarding the possible modality of interreligious dialogue can show a fundamental path. The recognition of the axiological characterization of the absolute, which constitutes the pole ad quem of religious experience. In fact, the manifestation of the absolute in the context of religious experience never takes the form of an epistemic absolute, but always and only as axiological, because the first understanding of this kind of manifestation assumes the form of a configuration of values. And this is a fundamental characteristic. In fact, this requires that this manifestation must always undergo a form of adaptation to the context. It cannot generate a neutral reaction mode. In this consequence, it is possible to note the profound difference between the dimension of epistemic universality and that of axiological universality. While the first is placed in a dimension of neutrality with respect to the ethical orientation, and for this reason can demand the need for the transfer of recognition of absoluteness. The second cannot be transferred at all in relation to the manifestation of the axiological universal. And this because its recognition is based on a personal adhesion. It is precisely this personal adhesion that cannot be transferred, because it cannot be imposed. In fact, the imposition under trait could not replace personal adherence, and therefore it would not really represent the acceptance of the manifestation of this kind of universal. An acceptance such as this adhesion implies an internal moment of articulation that corresponds to a real interpretation. An absolute that manifests itself through a meaning that cannot be directly transferred imposes the codification of this meaning. That is, it refers to an internal hermeneutic moment that cannot be eluded and which constitutes the authentic heart of this adhesion. Every religious experience needs to be codified or translated into a set of practices, starting from basic actions such as an individual prayer until the establishment of precise liturgies. But we know very well that any translation responds to an operation of contextualization according to different levels of approximation to transparency. And the context is always represented by a vital relationship of historical nature that is partly contingent. It's easy to understand how the hermeneutic moment constitutes a fundamental moment of the religious experience itself, because it orients in its dimension of maximum expression the real form of worship. In this sense, the lemma used by Jean Grandin in relation to religion, thought as the experience of the absolute and this translation into the contingency of the historical life, seems quite excellent to us when it defines religion as a believing cult, underlining the circularity existing between the two poles that constitute the formula, the cult and the faith. Excellent because this circularity presupposes the hermeneutic articulation. Now, it is true that the hermeneutic moment always produces an interpretation, and the different possibilities can lead precisely to a condition of an unsolvable conflict of interpretation, as Ricoeur could state. But this means that the hermeneutic moment presents itself as the metaphorical space of shared reason, a reason that is identified with the structural necessity of an interpretation due to the impossibility of reaching transferable evidence. Conclusions. Therefore, trying to get even closer to the central question, interreligious dialogue, seems to have possibilities if it orients its the inter or the interreligious, not so much directly to the common points, which are already codification that expresses specific content, but rather towards the structural dimension of the interpretative dynamics that underlies the authentic realization of the religious experience. But this implies the assumption of the value played by the context in the initial codification itself, and with this, also the assumption of a residue of meaning that resists to the total codification, because otherwise we would witness the dissolution of the experience of the absolute in the codification effort, which would annihilate the excess that makes the absolute precisely what really is. And we can understand how the constitutive dynamic of religious experience manifests a direct extremousness toward any fundamentalist drift. In fact, a fundamentalist position, in order to determine a single interpretative possibility of a specific religious experience, need to generate a crystallization of the first or second or third codification, etc., of this particular experience of excess which constitutes the religious experience. For this reason, while it apparently presents itself as the most stable modality of religious experience, reality, all fundamentalism embodies the direct betrayal of an experience which, in its completeness and complexity, lives on the articulation between the phenomenological moment and the hermeneutic moment, realizing itself according to the rationality capable of contemplating the articulation of these two moments. Two dimensions. The loss of the development of the hermeneutic process causes the direct destructuring of religious experience and its reduction to an horizontal dimension of a political but not democratic nature. Returning definitely to the interreligious dialogue, I believe that we can affirm that that only authentic possibility of its realization lies in the very questioning of the first level of codification, which does not mean questioning the sacred text, considered as a fundamental reference, but consists in our capacity to completely revive the original meaning of this codification, if it ever existed. If interreligious dialogue can truly exist only in the light of this capacity, and if this capacity is possible, then interreligious dialogue represents an essential way of being authentically believers, and above all, a continuous questioning of the possible violent degeneration of any religious position, beyond the mimetic desire, beyond all kind of ruins. Thank you very much.